Something has just exploded around Barça, and this time we're not talking about a simple transfer rumor. Because when Deco and Boyan get on a plane to London, it's because something very serious is happening. And yes, the news was broken by Gerard Romero on Gigantes. Deco and Boyan have traveled to London, and the name on the table is João Pedro, the Chelsea striker. A deal that, according to the latest reports, is much further along than people realize. And watch out, because this completely changes the picture for Barça this summer. Because until very recently, everything revolved around Julian Alvarez. It was all Julian, and Julian. But Barça has run into a huge wall called Atletico de Madrid. And while everyone was looking towards Argentina, Deco was working quietly. Because right now, the player who is closest to Barça is João Pedro. And pay attention to this, because the deal could easily reach 100 million euros. 100 million, an absolutely insane amount. But here comes the important question. Why is Barça willing to make such a big investment? Well, dear friends, the answer is simple. Because the club believes that the time to start the definitive transition after Roberto Lewandowski is now. This is the place. This is the moment. And this is something very important. Because Lewandowski keeps scoring goals, he is still making a difference. But as you know, his contract is ending, and he has already said goodbye to Barça. Therefore, Flick is very clear about it and wants a striker to take the Polish player's place. He has made history by scoring 120 goals in the 4 seasons he has been at Camp Barça. Flick has told Deco that he wants a mobile striker, an aggressive striker, a striker who presses high, someone who attacks space, someone who can play alongside Lamine Yamal. And this is where João Pedro fits perfectly into that idea. But wait. Because the most surprising thing isn't Deco and Bojan's trip. The most surprising thing is that Chelsea would already be willing to negotiate. And this changes absolutely everything. Because just a few weeks ago, it seemed impossible to even think about a deal like this. But right now in England, they're saying that Chelsea needs to make significant sales in this summer transfer window. And that's where Barça comes in. Because João Pedro is really liked within the club. Really liked. And not just by Deco. Also by Hansi Flick. And here's a very important detail that a lot of people are overlooking. Barça believes that João Pedro still hasn't reached his full potential. He's a very young player. And they believe he can become one of the best strikers in the world in the coming years. Honestly, looking at his profile, it makes sense. Because he has dribbling skills, he has physicality, he has technical quality, and he can score goals. That's important. And we understand that in the market, you have to pay for that. Also, the player can adapt to several positions on the field. And for Flick, being a versatile player is pure gold. Because the German coach wants a much more dynamic attack for next season. Much less static, much more aggressive. And João Pedro represents exactly that. Now then, here comes the big problem. Money. Because Barça still has huge financial limitations. And paying 100 million all at once is not an easy task. That's why the club is already working on a very specific formula to be able to complete the signing. And pay attention. Because here is the key to the whole operation. Barça wants to negotiate a structured payment. That is a lower initial amount, and of course to include add-ons. Installment payments. And possibly, it's not ruled out, to include conditions related to the statement, because the club doesn't want to overcommit financially again. Here's something that will really surprise you. Because within Barça, they believe that João Pedro could end up being more tactically important for Hansi Flick than even Julian Alvarez. Yes, that's right. Because Julian is an incredible striker, someone everyone longs for. But João Pedro has something that Flick values a lot, which is his ability to link up with others. The German wants a number 9 who not only scores goals, he wants a player who creates overloads, who moves out of the box, who combines, who draws defenders away. And that's where João Pedro is spectacular. In fact, at Barça, they believe he could form an incredible partnership with Lamine Yamal and Dani Olmo, with Fermin Lopez himself in that final third of the field. And watch out, because this is no longer just scouting. These are real conversations, contacts, meetings, serious moves. Because Deco and Boyan don't travel to London just to have a coffee. Remember that the last time Boyan and Deco traveled to the English capital was to finalize the signing of Hansi Flick. And Barça is traveling because they want to speed things up. Do they want to know what conditions Chelsea is putting on the table? To see if the alternative to Julian Alvarez, who in this case is the Brazilian João Pedro, fits better or worse. Within Barça's financial parameters for investing in this transfer market, Deco is scrutinizing every action, every negotiation. Everything has to be seen very clearly to avoid making any serious mistakes that could mortgage our future again. And watch out, because they know very well how they have to do it. João Pedro has a lot of suitors. There are several teams that also want to go after the Brazilian striker. And in England, they're talking about strong Premier League teams. And also, in the last few hours, Bayern Munich has also been mentioned, which, despite having Harry Kane, also wants a top striker to play alongside the Englishman. But here another key factor comes into play, which is the player's wishes. Because João Pedro is very keen on playing for Barça, and this is fundamental. Because Flick's project is generating a lot of respect throughout Europe. A lot, absolutely. The players see that Barça is competing again and that it has a great football philosophy, an idea that makes Barça an attractive club. And that wasn't happening a few years ago. But there's something even more important behind all of this, and that's that Barça feels it has so much at stake this summer. Because the club knows that it's not enough to just win national titles. They want to truly compete for the Champions League again. And for that, they need to raise both the physical and competitive level of their attacking line. Flick wants total intensity, high pressing, quick transitions, constant direct play. And honestly, Lewandowski no longer had that level of pace to keep up for the whole season. And this is not a criticism of the great Robert Lewandowski. It's just football logic. Because our striker is 37 years old. And Barça obviously needs a replacement. Lewandowski's departure will make way for that new number 9, which Hansi Flick is so eager to add to the attack. João Pedro today, according to Gigante, according to Gerard Romero, it becomes a strategic move, and not just as a signing, but as a striker for the future. And here comes a delicate issue, the sales. We already addressed this topic yesterday in the video on our channel about Julian Alvarez. There we already broke down for you a bit what Barca's idea is. And obviously, it also applies to a move for João Pedro. Because if João Pedro arrives for an amount close to 100 million euros, that would mean there would have to be significant departures. Yes, very significant. And this is where the tough decisions start. Because Barça needs to free up wage bill space and generate income. And some important names could leave if interesting offers come in. Because one thing is clear. Barça can't make a 100 million signing without moving some pieces. That's impossible. But be careful. Be careful. Because there's a detail that seems key in this whole story. Because normally when a deal isn't serious, quick denials appear. Negative leaks. Noise. But here the opposite is happening. More and more information is coming out. More moves, more meetings, more signs. And that usually means one thing, that Barca is really working to sign a number 9 in this transfer window. And honestly, the feeling is that Flick is pushing really hard. Of course, really hard. Because the German coach doesn't want to start the preseason without having the number 9 signed. He wants to work on patterns of play as soon as possible. Let's remember that João Pedro is not going to the World Cup with Brazil, in case he is the one they choose. And if he signs for Barca, he could join from the very beginning. To work hand in hand from day one, with Hansi Flick, And that explains Deco's urgency to assess and negotiate. What are the conditions that the blue team is putting on the table? Let's remember that João Pedro is under contract and that he has only spent one season at the London club. Because Barça doesn't want this deal to drag on until August. In the same way, something similar is happening with Julian Alvarez. Barça, whether they sign one or the other, wants to do it with the deal wrapped up before the World Cup. Barça wants to get ahead. They want to close the deal quickly. And here's something I'll tell you. If Barça manages to sign João Pedro for less than 100 million euros, it could be one of the most important deals of the European summer. Because we're talking about a young striker with huge potential for growth and perfectly adaptable to Hansi Flick's style of football. But there's no need to go crazy either. We already talked about it in yesterday's video because the deal is still very complicated. Yes, sir, extremely complicated. Chelsea isn't stupid either. And they know the potential that the Brazilian striker has. And of course, they're not going to give him away, especially not to Barça, because there are also Premier League clubs with a lot of purchasing power. Who are ahead of Barça at this moment? Barcelona. If there's one thing that characterizes them today, it's the appeal we talked about earlier. The whole squad they have, the core group, the youth, the stars like Lamine Yamal and Pedri, they're crazy about playing with these kids. But it's true that there are clubs with much more financial power than Barça. They can handle, with a snap of their fingers, the signing of the Brazilian. Because if João Pedro prioritizes Barça, the scenario changes a lot. It's not the same to negotiate without knowing the player's interest as it is when you're sure the footballer is desperate to come. It's the same case as with Julian Alvarez. That's why Deco and Bojan have traveled to London to convince, to sell him on the project, to show him he'd have a leading role, and to show the Brazilian player how important he'd be, and of course to listen as we've mentioned. Those terms Chelsea is setting for the negotiations. It would be a much faster Barça, more aggressive, more unpredictable, a more modern Barça. I think there's something very serious going on. There are, I repeat, too many signs, too many moves, a lot of noise coming from England, and above all, they've been caught by major outlets and by several Spanish journalists. When these Barça executives entered the city of London, I repeat, Bojan and Deco are not traveling to London by chance. And when Gerard Romero reports something like this, normally it's because Barça is already involved in the deal. And now I ask the following question. Will João Pedro be the ultimate heir to Robert Lewandowski? Is Barça ready to make a historic investment again? And how far is Joan Laporta willing to go to give Hansi Flick the striker he wants? Because if things continue like this in the next few hours, this story could explode at any moment. Let me know in the comments what you think about this news regarding João Pedro. And if you prefer the Julian Alvarez option or the Brazilian from Chelsea. Barça yesterday, Barça today, Barça always.